She had left it there as a joke, a single wildflower on the most disciplined desk in the entire estate. And she never imagined that 2 years later, she would find that same fragile bloom pressed carefully between the pages of the Duke's personal book, preserved like something sacred, like something remembered far too well. But in the beginning, it meant nothing. Or at least that is what she told herself on that quiet afternoon, when the house felt unusually still and the air seemed heavy with the kind of silence that made even small acts feel louder than they were. And she, moving through the study with a stack of documents balanced in her hands, had paused just long enough to notice how painfully perfect everything was, how the desk stood in rigid order, every paper aligned, every pen placed precisely, every inch of space controlled by a man who did not allow accidents. And perhaps that was what made her do it. Not rebellion exactly, not mischief either, but something softer, something born from the strange tension between admiration and quiet frustration, because she had come to understand the Duke in fragments. The way he spoke less than necessary, the way he noticed more than he admitted, the way he carried his responsibilities like armor rather than burden. And yet there was something in him that felt unfinished, something human carefully folded away beneath discipline. And so when she stepped outside briefly and saw the small wildflower growing stubbornly between the stones of the garden path, bright and uninvited and completely out of place, she picked it without thinking, turning it between her fingers as if weighing an idea she had not yet formed. And when she returned to the study, she did not hesitate. She simply set it down on his desk, right in the center where it could not be ignored, not arranged in a vase or hidden among the papers, but placed deliberately in its simplicity. A quiet disruption in a world that resisted disruption. And for a moment, she stood there looking at it, a faint smile touching her lips because it felt absurdly satisfying, as though she had proven something small and unnecessary. And then, just as quickly, she moved on, gathering her things, finishing her work, and leaving the room with the easy certainty that the flower would be gone within minutes of his return, discarded without thought, dismissed as meaningless, because that was what such gestures were in a place like this. Temporary, forgettable, insignificant. But when the Duke entered his study that evening, long after the corridors had emptied and the house had settled into its usual quiet, he noticed it immediately, not because it was large or striking, but because it did not belong. And he was a man who understood belonging with unsettling precision, his gaze falling to the small bloom resting against the polished wood, its petals slightly uneven, its stem bent just enough to suggest it had been handled without care. And he stood there for a moment longer than necessary, not moving closer, not reaching for it, simply observing, as though the act of touching it might require a decision he had not yet made. And though he did not need proof, he knew it had been her, not through evidence, but through instinct, because she was the only one in the house who moved through his world without being entirely shaped by it, the only one who spoke without rehearsing, who acted without calculating, who existed without bending herself to the rigid expectations that defined everything around him. And there was something about that, something unsettling and quietly compelling, that made him hesitate now, because removing the flower would restore order, it would return the room to its intended state, it would erase the interruption as though it had never happened. And yet for reasons he did not immediately examine, he did not reach for it. Instead, he moved past it, setting down his gloves, loosening the tension in his shoulders, and only after several minutes, after he had pretended to occupy himself with other tasks, did he finally step back toward the desk, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the wood before pausing just above the fragile petals. And in that pause there was something unspoken, something he would not have named even if asked, because it was not about the flower itself but about what it represented. A moment unscripted, unplanned, unapproved, and he realized, with a clarity that surprised him, that he did not want to erase it just yet, that he did not want to pretend it had not existed. And so, instead of discarding it, he opened the book that lay nearest to him, a volume he had been reading without much attention, its pages dense with words that rarely held his focus for long, and with a careful motion that seemed far more deliberate than the act deserved. He placed the flower between those pages, closing the book gently as though preserving something fragile, something that might otherwise disappear. And when he stepped back again, the desk was once more in perfect order, the interruption hidden, the evidence removed. And yet something had shifted, something subtle and unacknowledged, because though the room looked unchanged, it no longer felt entirely the same. And he found himself standing there longer than he should have, his gaze resting briefly on the book before turning away, as if distancing himself from the decision he had just made, because it was, in the end, a small thing, an insignificant act, one that required no explanation and invited no consequence. And yet it lingered in his thoughts far longer than it should have, following him through the evening in quiet, persistent ways, until even he could not entirely dismiss it as meaningless, though he would try. Of course he would, because men like him did not assign importance to flowers left as jokes, did not preserve moments that carried no defined purpose, did not allow themselves to dwell on things that could not be justified. And yet, without admitting it even to himself, he had already done exactly that. And somewhere beyond the walls of the house, she moved forward with her life, unaware that her careless gesture had been noticed, that it had been kept, that it had already begun to settle into something neither of them yet understood, something quiet and patient and far more enduring than either of them would have believed possible in that moment. The flower should have been forgotten by spring, but it wasn't, and that was the beginning of everything neither of them would say aloud. The house moved on as it always did, seasons shifting with quiet efficiency, corridors filled and emptied by different footsteps, duties replacing one another without pause. And yet beneath that steady rhythm something subtle had taken root, something that did not belong to routine, because though she carried on as she always had, completing her tasks with calm precision, speaking when spoken to, existing within the careful boundaries the estate demanded, there were moments now, small and fleeting, when she felt his attention linger just a second longer than necessary, not obvious enough to be remarked upon, not intentional enough to be called deliberate, but present in a way that unsettled her more than open scrutiny ever could. And she told herself it was nothing, that she was imagining patterns where none existed, because it was easier to believe that than to consider the alternative, that the Duke, a man so governed by restraint, might be noticing things he had no reason to notice, might be remembering something as trivial as a flower left on his desk. And yet on the other side of that same silence, he found himself increasingly aware of her in ways that defied his usual discipline, not in grand gestures or dramatic realizations, but in the quiet accumulation of details, the way her voice remained steady even when others faltered, the way she moved through rooms without disturbing their order and yet somehow altering their atmosphere, the way she spoke to him without the careful deference he had grown accustomed to from everyone else. And it was that last thing, more than anything, that unsettled him, because it made their conversations feel less like exchanges of obligation and more like something dangerously close to equality. And equality, in his world, was not a simple thing. It was not something that could exist without consequence. And so he kept his distance, or at least he tried to, reinforcing the boundaries that had always defined his life, reminding himself that whatever this quiet awareness was, it had no place in reality, that it was better left unexamined, unspoken. And yet despite that, the book remained on his desk, untouched but never moved, its presence a quiet contradiction to the discipline he prided himself on. Because if the flower meant nothing, there would have been no reason to keep it. And if it meant something, there would have been no justification for doing so. And so he existed in that uncomfortable space between logic and instinct, choosing neither, acknowledging neither, and time, indifferent as always, continued forward, carrying them both toward a moment neither of them anticipated, because her leaving was not dramatic, not marked by confrontation or confession, but it was decisive in its quietness, a simple announcement delivered with the same composure. She brought to everything else an opportunity elsewhere, a position more suited to her future, something practical, reasonable, entirely expected, and he listened as she explained it, his expression unchanged, his response measured and appropriate, because anything else would have required him to step outside the role he had spent his entire life perfecting. And so he did what he had always done. He accepted it. He acknowledged her reasoning. He told her it was a sensible decision, that he wished her well, that the estate would, of course, make the necessary arrangements for her departure. And not once did he ask her to stay. Not once did he question whether she truly wanted to leave, because those questions belonged to a version of himself he had never allowed to exist. And yet when she turned to go, there was a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation, a moment where it felt as though something might be said, something might be changed, but it passed as quickly as it came, and the silence between them settled into something final, something that could not be undone by words left unspoken. And just like that, she was gone, her presence reduced to memory, her absence filling the spaces she had once occupied with a quiet that felt heavier than before, and he returned to his routines with the same precision as always, the same discipline, the same outward control, but the house did not feel the same, not in any way he could easily define, only in the accumulation of small absences. The lack of her voice in conversations, the absence of her footsteps in familiar corridors, the way certain moments now felt incomplete without any obvious reason, and he dismissed it. Of course he did, attributing it to change, to adjustment, to the natural progression of things, because anything else would have required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would have required action, and action was something he had already chosen against. And so the days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and eventually into years, each one layering over the last until the past felt distant enough to ignore, or at least to pretend it no longer held relevance. And yet some things refused to be erased entirely, because one evening, long after her departure had settled into something resembling permanence, he found himself reaching for the book without thinking, his hand moving with a familiarity he had not consciously recognized. And when he opened it, the flower was still there, flattened and fragile but unmistakably intact, its color faded but not gone, preserved in a way that defied the passage of time, and he stared at it for a long moment, longer than he would have allowed himself if he had been thinking clearly, because in that instant, the years between then and now seemed to collapse, reduced to something insignificant in the face of a memory that had never truly disappeared, and he realized, with a clarity that was both unwelcome and undeniable, that he had not kept the flower out of absent-mindedness, that it had not been forgotten or overlooked, but deliberately preserved, protected in the only way he knew how, hidden within the pages of a book he had never finished, as though some part of him had refused to move forward entirely, had refused to close that chapter in the most literal sense, and the realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit, because it suggested something deeper than simple sentiment, something that could not be dismissed as trivial or inconsequential. And yet even then, even with that understanding pressing quietly against his carefully maintained composure, he did nothing. He closed the book, returned it to its place, and resumed his life as though nothing had changed, because that was what he had always done, what he would always do, until the past, preserved and patient, found its way back to him in a form he could no longer ignore. She was not supposed to find it. Of all the things that could have survived those 2 quiet, carefully managed years, it should not have been a fragile wildflower pressed between the pages of a book. And yet there she stood in the Duke's study once again, the same room she had left behind with such certainty, holding in her hands the one thing that proved nothing had been as forgotten as she had believed. Her return had been practical, temporary, explained with reasons that required no emotion. Estate business, a short-term arrangement, nothing more. And she had repeated those reasons to herself as she crossed the threshold, as she walked the familiar corridors, as she reassured her own thoughts that nothing here could affect her anymore, that whatever she had once felt in this place had long since settled into something distant and irrelevant. And for a while, it seemed true, because the house looked unchanged, the routines remained intact, and he was exactly as she remembered, composed, measured, every movement controlled with the same quiet authority that had once made him seem untouchable. And their first conversations reflected that distance, polite and efficient, 2 people speaking as though the past between them had been nothing more than a brief and insignificant overlap, and it might have remained that way. It might have continued in that careful balance of restraint and unspoken understanding, if not for the moment she found herself alone in his study again, sent to retrieve a document, a simple task that required no thought, no reflection, just familiarity. And yet the moment she stepped inside, something shifted, not visibly, not in any way she could explain, but in a way that made the air feel heavier, as though the room itself remembered her presence even if she had tried to forget it, and she moved toward the desk with steady hands, focusing on the purpose that had brought her there, refusing to let memory interfere with something so routine. And that was when she noticed the book, resting slightly apart from the others, not out of place enough to draw attention under normal circumstances, but different enough that it caught hers, and she hesitated, just for a second, before reaching for it, because something about it felt familiar, though she could not immediately say why. And when she opened it, it was not expectation that made her breath catch, but recognition, because there, between the pages, pressed flat and impossibly preserved, was the flower she had left behind as nothing more than a passing thought, a careless joke, something she had not even remembered until this exact moment. And yet here it was, unchanged in the way that mattered, held in place as though time itself had chosen not to disturb it. And for a long moment she simply stared at it, her mind moving through the past in fragments, trying to reconcile what she had believed with what she was now seeing, because this was not something that could be dismissed as coincidence or oversight. This was deliberate. This was intentional. This was a choice made and maintained over 2 years of silence. And the weight of that realization settled slowly, not as shock, but as clarity, because it changed everything in a way she had not prepared for. It turned something meaningless into something significant, something forgotten into something remembered, and it forced her to confront the possibility that the distance between them had not been as absolute as she had assumed, that perhaps, in ways neither of them had acknowledged, something had remained, something quiet and unresolved, and she was still standing there, the book open in her hands, the fragile evidence of that truth resting between its pages. When he entered the room, his presence as steady and unannounced as ever, and he stopped the moment he saw her, not because of surprise, but because of understanding, because he knew immediately what she had found, not from the position of the book or the expression on her face, but from the simple fact that there was only one thing in that room that could create this kind of silence. And for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, because there are moments when words feel insufficient, when the truth exists so clearly between two people that speaking it aloud almost feels unnecessary. And yet it was she who broke that silence, her voice quieter than usual, stripped of the certainty she had carried when she arrived. "You kept it," she said, not as an accusation, not even as a question, but as a statement of fact that demanded an explanation all the same. And he did not deny it, did not look away, did not retreat into the safety of distance, because something about this moment, about the years that had led to it, left no room for pretense. "Yes," he answered simply, and the honesty of that single word carried more weight than anything else he could have said, because it confirmed what she already knew, that this had not been accidental, that this had been a choice made again and again every time he had seen that book, and decided not to remove what was inside it. And she closed the book slowly, carefully, as though the act itself required intention now, as though she understood that she was not just holding paper and pressed petals, but something far more fragile, something that had existed quietly between them without either of them acknowledging it. "Why?" she asked, and the question lingered, not because it was difficult to answer, but because it required a kind of truth neither of them had ever spoken before, and he could have given her something safe, something distant, something that would allow them both to step back into the roles they had been playing since her return. But instead, he chose differently, because it mattered, he said, his voice steady but unguarded in a way she had never heard before. And for a moment, she said nothing, because the simplicity of that answer made it impossible to ignore, impossible to reinterpret. It was not wrapped in explanation or softened by justification. It was just the truth, plain and unprotected, and it shifted something between them, something subtle but undeniable, because it meant that what she had dismissed as insignificant had not been insignificant to him, that what she had forgotten had been remembered, that what she had left behind had not been discarded. And in that realization, the years of silence between them seemed to lose some of their distance, not erased, not undone, but understood in a way they had not been before. And when she finally moved, it was not to return the book to its place, not to hide the evidence of what she had discovered, but to set it down on the desk between them, open and visible, as though acknowledging it for what it was, a quiet truth that could no longer remain hidden. And when she looked up at him again, there was something different in her expression, something less guarded, less certain, but more honest, because for the first time, neither of them could pretend that. Nothing had existed between them, and for the first time, neither of them chose to walk away from it.